Welcome to Directionally Correct, a People's podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, John Boudreau, Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Effective Organizations at USC, and Pete Ramstad, former CHRO and Strategy and Organizational Consultant.
Go.
Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization. John, I'm so tickled with what you're wearing today. In terms of the callback to,
right.
Yeah, I think how you found out about the podcast.
Well, how do you find out about the podcast? What's that?
Well, maybe I'll tee up the story and then John can kind of take it from there. But I can't remember whose episode it was, but at one point I was talking about, because in my mind I see a person like John Boudreau as like a famous person. Like in my world, John is famous, and so I'd seen him speak at a conference. And he was wearing like a cowboy jacket is what I felt like. And we talked about on the podcast. Come to find out, like I got an email thread sent to me from a few folks that had gotten around to John and we had talked about it and found out about it. So I appreciate you being a good sport, John, showing up in the cowboy vest for the podcast.
Yeah, well, it appears to be my defining characteristic, like I said, these days. So I was delighted. I wrote people back and said, yeah, this is the arc of my career. You know, I used to be famous for academic articles, and then I was famous for leadership books and articles, and now I'm famous for what I wear at the conference. So, yeah.
There's no such thing as bad publicity, right?
I guess so.
It's all the same.
We'll see after this one.
John was present at, it was a Workday conference, Connected Commons, that I was, someone spilled coffee on me. That's the famous one where like someone like he was not in the room at the time, but he was there. I definitely remember this in Pleasanton some time ago. It's been a long time.
Well, John, you kind of queued it up in terms of like the progression of your fame and your career. I think one of the reasons why both of you being guests on the podcast today is such an honor for us is I saw the book that you all wrote, Beyond HR, as a very formative book in my career, but I imagine in many people's careers in terms of how they think about talent and kind of the equation of how we think about quantifying the value of talent to organizations and what role variation plays in that. And I know, Pete, you have a background in kind of economic analysis and how that frames your lens on the world. But can you guys talk to us a little bit about that book? Because I feel like it is so relevant at this moment. And I'm not sure anybody's paying attention to this type of research at this moment either. And so maybe that can tee you guys up to talk about it.
Well, maybe I'm just going to start the story of a little bit of how the book began to come out. Pete and I, we had a whole bunch of common connections, many of which went through the board of a company called Personnel Decisions International, which was kind of a executive assessment board, very much anchored in the research at the University of Minnesota and people who were publishing there at the time. And back in the late 90s, several different contexts, let's see, Wayne Cassio, George Milkovich, and others were saying to me, John, you've got to meet this guy, Pete Ramstad, who's working for Personnel Decisions International. I said, okay, what's he like? And they said, oh, he's a CFO, an accounting guy, and all that. And I said, well, okay, I guess that's all right. I can certainly chat with a finance and accounting person. And as Pete and I got to talking, and one of the first things he said was, John, we've got, at that case, it would be file cabinets full of assessments of executives, thousands and thousands of these assessments that we do based on rigorously designed psychometric tests and simulations and other things like that. And he said, I come from finance and I'm familiar with bond ratings, and the rating of a financial bond is the prediction of the future performance of an asset that's uncertain. You can't really say exactly what a bond will be worth in the future, but we have these things called bond ratings, AAA, AA, B, right? And those ratings are a kind of rigorous way to predict the future value of this unpredictable asset. And he said, it seems to me executive assessments are like that. And this information we have in our file cabinets could be seen as bond ratings on executives, an uncertain asset with future value. And I was kind of hooked on Pete at that point. And as we've talked about, Cole in particular, there's a great deal of that kind of finding a metaphor in a discipline that leaders already understand. I call it a place where leaders are already using their smart brain. So if you get them started thinking about financial assets, they lock into a financial set of decision models, a financial set of mental models. Those are pretty rigorous. They've learned them. They're held accountable for using them well. And so when they think about money, they've kind of been expected and trained to think about money in a certain rigorous way based on principles that come to them from this finance discipline. And so one of the tricks I've often tried to use is to find a metaphor like that, get executives into their smart brain, and then talk to them about something like executive assessment. And you can do it for all kinds of things in HR, performance management, rewards. Right now, there's a great deal of discussion about what do we do under uncertainty. And there's plenty of tools from the finance world about how you hedge and how you create a portfolio that has a certain payoff under many, many different future scenarios, even though you can't predict any one of them. So that's my introduction to Pete. And that was the beginning of a lot of work we did together that ultimately produced Beyond HR in 2007.
And to show you how naive I was, I started building some of these models. I'm trying to work on PDI showing value, just from my economics perspective. And one of the IO psychologists, one of the dozens and dozens of well-trained IO psychologists we had at PDI, goes, "Oh, you're going down into the utility trap. You're going into the utility rabbit hole." And he said, "You ought to read these papers by Wayne Cassio." I go, "Oh, I know Wayne. He's on the board. What does he do?" I had no idea. I knew Wayne personally. I'd interacted with him several times as a board member at that time of the subsidiary PDRI, but I had no idea. And so the whole introduction to utility analysis and the integration of the IO world at that time with the economic world was kind of my through the lens of being at PDI. I happened to be a graduate student in accounting theory at that time. And so I just happened to be studying the theory of economics and accounting, and by happenstance immersed in an IO psychology firm, thinking it was going to be a temporary job for 2 years while I went to graduate school. They were a client of mine for my CPA firm days. That's how I knew them. That's how they knew me. Anyway, and I ended up spending 16 years at PDI. It really had a really tremendous experience with a lot of really, really smart people inside and outside of PDI.
It feels like the world's changing so quickly that like these sort of things are even more important, like trying to derive the value of a specific employee, the specific job functions, this sort of stuff. Like how has like the recent advent of like, say, like Gen AI or like the oncoming of Gen AI going to impact these sort of assessments on like how we select people and what we value moving forward?
Yeah, let me just take my crack at it, because here's what I'm excited about, and here's what I'm worried about. Okay, and the other thing is I like to look at historical analogies. Okay, and I'm not sure we're well enough organized to take advantage of AI well. And I would say that in the 70s, we weren't well enough organized to take advantage of the new enterprise software systems that were coming through. So, all of a sudden, HR and finance got great software tools in the 70s and 80s. The difference was finance had been doing consolidations and financial reporting and stuff for 50 years. So they had well-honed practices they could automate. And the joke I say is that all of a sudden HR starts brainstorming turnover codes. because they got to code turnover. They didn't ever code turnover before. And one of the problems we have is that we try to do, this is something I feel really strongly about. I want to differentiate some of the work that John and I do. We try to link too much to the accounting rather than the essence of the economics behind the accounting. Trying to apply accounting measures to HR will not work well at all. I can just tell you 1,000 ways that it goes wrong. But if you distill the theory behind why the accounting's that way, then you get down to the raw elements that give you a lot of insight into how HR can do a better job.
Well, like,
And
what are we talking about there? Like, what are we talking
I'll
about?
give you an example. I mean, I hear people say, "Oh, people are our most important asset. If only people were on the balance sheet." Well,
Yeah.
the essence of strategy is to be as balance sheet light as possible. So people are on the balance. Nobody wants plants on their balance sheet. Nobody wants inventory. I mean, economic value is driven by driving down the value of your assets on the balance sheet. And most economic and most balance sheet restructurings are reducing assets. And people want to be asset light companies. So it sounds great.
Is that any better than being a liability though, which is I think what they are right now?
No, they're a holding cost.
They're a holding cost. Okay.
Yeah, they're not a liability. There's no future cost of people that's associated with that. I mean, you might have some pensions and some certain kind of situations where you made certain contractual obligations financially. But the idea is we don't have brands on the balance sheet, and nobody has any trouble investing in brands.
Yeah.
What's the value?
Those show up in stock price though, right? In terms
What's that?
of those show up in the stock price though, right? With the differentials between how much a firm is evaluated versus what they're trading at is like the attributed to the brand. Is that correct?
It's attributed to intangible assets. We don't know which ones, and there are people, but you just have to get into the guts of it. You know what I mean, to really know what you're doing. But Coca-Cola. Everybody understands there's tremendous value in that brand.
Yeah,
no question about it. A huge part of the Tesla loss of valuation in the last 4 months has been a perceived erosion of the value of that brand. But my point is if we just try to do simplistic things, if we only had people on the balance sheet or try to apply accounting per se as it stands, or try to apply GAAP to people, we're never going to get any place any better in analytics at all.
So what are some like simple things that organizations can do to better judge the quality of their talent and the future value of their talent?
Yeah, understand their bond ratings.
Yeah. So my first suggestion is around that. It could go a lot of different ways. But one of I'll give you a real tangible example. I would really focus on analytics on holding line leaders accountable for talent decisions.
Okay.
And I wouldn't try to measure much else around that. So when I talk to CHROs, I say, would you like to have measures as powerful as they have in finance? And yes. Well, how many of the measures in finance tell you what the finance department is doing? And the answer is almost none. What they do is they hold the line leaders accountable for the asset that finance cares about. And, even things as simple as time to hire, days to fill, right? When I changed that from days to fill by job type to days to fill by line manager, it changed the whole dynamic of the discussion with my executive team.
Well, kind of along these lines, I know in prepping for this, Pete, and I'd love to get your perspective too, John. We talked about what are the human capital topics that boards of directors care about? So, pushing the analytics to the line leader level is kind of the I guess the nirvana that maybe we should be pursuing. But if you're aggregating that up at the company level, what are the types of things that boards care about or should be caring about? And what do you guys from your experience think about that?
Go ahead, John. You want me to talk? What's that?
Well, I think I'll just give my quick example is that I think boards, particularly since COVID, were directed a much greater attention to people and work, and we might even say and HR. And I think you saw an elevation of attention to the HR leader during COVID. That continued with the George Floyd incident and all the kind of flurry of attention that came beyond that. And so you really saw with boards an elevation of attention to this thing called HR. Not that they weren't there before, but I think it really brought HR leaders, CHROs, et cetera, into the attention of boards. And that's kind of produced these days various calls for scorecards or dashboards that boards would find useful. And I sense that those may be different than the scorecards or dashboards that HR might be using, or even that we might use with line leaders. I think for me, I don't know that we have a very well-developed answer, honestly. I think that, the bottom line would be that for me, it would be much more about what boards understand and how they think about this rather than about any certain measures. So a quick example, I've seen a number of lists in which boards say we'd like to know more about the internal promotion rate. and how much are we moving people between jobs in the organization? And again, one of my favorite thought experiments would be to say to boards, assume we had a perfect measure of that. Okay, you've asked for it, and assume we had a very, very good measure of the proportion of positions filled internally. What would be the right number? So as a board member, why did you ask for that? What's your logic about that number and how it fits with your concept of value? And I think what I would get is answers all over the map. Some would say, I guess I thought it should be close to 100%. And that seems good to me because we're developing our people internally. And somebody else will say, well, no, I don't think 100%. That's awfully expensive when there's really good talent outside. And so, gosh, I think maybe closer to 50%. And I don't think either of those is really going to be a right answer. But it would tee up the idea that, well, to really answer that question, we're going to have to dig in to how internal movement actually affects the value proposition. And we're going to have to now agree that there's going to be some places where it ought to be maybe close to zero because the best talent in the world is actually outside, and some places where it should be really high. But just asking for that number, and I think HR is often quick to provide the number. Oh, goodness, the board asked for it. This is terrific. They finally recognize HR measurement as key and to just rush to providing that almost as a service provider when the opportunity exists to step back and do something like I described, to step back and say, why is it you asked for that? And what is your mental model about how value is created in a workforce if that's one of the things you asked for? Same kind of thing with things like culture, et cetera.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I want to build on that. So I think resisting the reaction to the board is really important. So John and I would say you have to teach the board in advance. The board already knows discounted cash flow. The board already knows the principles of capital allocation. So they come in already knowing the mental model, so they know how to process the data. And one of the challenges that CHROs have to do is they have to teach the mental models. Otherwise, the board's just going to ask for things and apply data in random ways. I'll give you an example, and it's one that and I know you kind of kid, you don't want to talk about it much anymore, but the whole work from home discussion a little bit, it's
hey, we'll talk about it. I mean, come on.
Okay. Yeah. If you take it down to its economics, changing your policy on work from home changes your supply of talent.
Oh, yeah. Now you're talking my language.
Okay. It's a supply and demand curve. Mm-hmm. But we also know if you don't have any selection validity, it doesn't matter if you're choosing from a pool of 20 or a pool of 5, because zero selection validity means that the size of the pool doesn't matter.
Just random guessing there.
Right. The example I use when I teach it to line managers is, you can give me 100 cantaloupes to choose from. I don't know what I'm doing. So you might as well give me 5. give Martha Stewart 100 cantaloupes. You're going to end up with a dandy cantaloupe, and so all of a sudden, the impact of demand only matters if you have selection validity.
Yep. Okay. Can I nerd out on this for just a second? Because what you're really describing is the concept from utility analysis of SDY. So being able to
that's the next step, right?
Yep. Being able to quantify the measure of the value of a standard deviation in performance once you know the validity coefficients of what you're doing. And I think great callback to Wayne Cascio and to John Boudreau's work and Alexis Fink, prior guest on the podcast as well, in investing with people. Love this concept. And so maybe you could build on that for us and why that's so important, Pete.
Yeah. Well, then the next step is you don't go through the process of trying to estimate SDY.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But you say, what's the break-even SDY? Okay. So this is what they would learn from the whole options analysis with the, I can't think of the name of the options evaluation biologist. What they do is every day, every option, you can see an implied.
The Black-Scholes.
Yeah, Black-Scholes. Thank you. Yeah, Black-Scholes. It's actually, to date myself, that we had to study the derivative of that model as part of our when I was in graduate school. But it's what they do is they say, all right, if options are trading here, this implies a volatility here. Okay, so you can take. Let's assume we have this much demand reduction, which you can measure. Assume we have this much validity, which you can estimate. Therefore, your break-even SDY on work from home is X. And if it's 200,000 or if it's 5,000, well, those result in different kinds of decisions. And John and I further recommended that to refine those kind of models, why not run experiments in your company? You're talked on some of your podcasts about A, B, and stuff like that. Maybe different divisions have different kinds of dynamics. But the idea is to put a decision model in front of it. And by the way, that's where bond ratings really became valuable. They were interesting. All of a sudden, then we had capital asset pricing models that made them really powerful. It's the decision models that make the information powerful. Yeah. And we try to get so much data out there, we don't spend enough time working the decision models to a level where a board or a line manager, et cetera, can understand.
Surely you can shift those sort of metrics too by just like throwing a bunch of money at people as well. Like you may not want to come in the office 5 days a week, but if you throw enough money at people, you change your selection pool, but that's going to cost you, of course.
That's another way to affect supply and demand, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the ways to affect supply and demand. And you may find you have a very, very nonlinear curve. I think we're seeing lots of signs of nonlinear curve, that there's a lot of benefit in giving people 2 days work from home. You know what I mean? Yeah. Those kinds of things. They do that in marketing all the time. They estimate utility curves. They estimate, and they run experiments. So they build the decision models and then populate them with data based on their own internal companies.
Why isn't this used more often? Like, why don't companies use this? Like, if all the leaders are like, well adept with like MBAs and all this sort of stuff, they ostensibly think in this sort of manner, it's not regularly applied in HR. Why is that?
Well, not taught for one.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about that, because when I originally reached out to John about this and we were talking about some of these topics, and in his infinite humility, he was like, Cole, nobody cares about this stuff anymore. And we figured this all out, in the 90s or the early 2000s. Why do you think this is even relevant? And the thing I said is because I feel like there's just been this great forgetting that if something hasn't happened in the last 3, 5, 10 years in HR, it's like we never knew it at all. And so there was all this mass amount of knowledge that was gained. I don't know anybody who's doing utility analysis anymore, or that would even know to do it. It's not just that they don't do it. It's like that they would even know to do it. So I would love you guys to talk about, just the power of variation and being able to quantify that, like how some of these ideas are very applicable, especially at this moment in time, and why it's so relevant to get over this great forgetting that we've had.
So most people learn utility analysis as a way to cost justify the selection system they want to install. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing your benefit analysis to drive your agenda, that you want to justify your training programs, you want to justify your selection process, you want to justify HR investments, that's 90% of the people that even know utility analysis. That's the default that they come in terms of what they're trying to do with it. And even then, they don't do a good job of explaining it to people who don't understand it. So you're coming in already with a bias that the CFO doesn't understand the model, CFO doesn't want to spend on HR, and you're going to show them some formula they've never seen or understood before and expect them to make a decision with it. You take that same exact model and apply it to a really important decision around how can we affect supply and demand of talent and how that impacts us in 1, 3, and 5 years. And rather than saying, here's the answer, you say, here's the break-even points. And then the CFO's job and the line manager say, do we think we're above or below that number? You show them where the decision changes, not what you expect to have it happen. And so that's the kind of stuff and we just haven't had a lot of people analytics and CHROs that are prepared to do that and know how to apply it and say, oh, this is really, nobody says work from home is a supply demand problem that utility analysis really helps us answer well.
Well, now they do.
Yeah. Well, would you see, Cole, what I'm saying, how that changes the process?
I totally understand it. John, I want to kick it to you here for a second. First of all, I think you've done really great work in this space, but also you have published some things more recently thinking of like work without jobs, right? And kind of what's going on there and the decomposition of work. And then I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe that came out slightly before generative AI kind of entered the picture. Yeah. Has that accelerated the trend? And can you speak to that at all in its relationship to how we even think about what constitutes work and who does work and all of that?
Yeah, but maybe again, we're having fun with analogies today. So I'll kind of put an analogy out there first, and then we can talk about the implications. So I think, again, if I were talking to non-HR executives about work without jobs and about this, the basic idea is to consider whether looking at work with a unit of analysis that would be what's inside jobs. So it would be tasks or projects or something like that. I always like to think about a job description. Let's say we print it out and then we slice it up, and all the things that are inside it, all the tasks that are inside it become now, like strips of paper. And let's say we did that for a team in a distribution center. So we take all these things we call jobs, we'd lay them all out, we'd snip them up, and then we'd say, you get to arrange these tasks in the most logical way possible. I've done this. I've talked to a lot of school teachers about this who came through COVID and said it really shined a light on how much of our time is spent on administration and meetings and stuff like that, and how all of the data says that you need a couple of hours of prep for an hour of being in front of a classroom at least. And so if you really were to arrange this, you'd make prep much bigger. You'd make in front of the classroom much bigger. You drop the meetings down, and you get to that a bit more easily if you're allowed to say, well, you don't have to say how many teachers do we need with this job description. You can say how much more time in prep do we need? How much more time in the classroom do we need? And then go reconstruct the work to reflect what you've discovered there. And it really does have, so that's kind of, and the analogy would be, right when we were writing this book, I was working with a pet food company, and we were trying to figure out how to express this analogy to their leaders. And as Pete said, what I find is we need metaphors to engage their smart mind. So I would say, well, here's how I would present it to them. Remember the days when you created pet food, and the choices you had was how much bone to put in, how much meat to put in, and how much grain to put in. And with those units of analysis, you could mix up pet food. It was pretty blunt edged. And then someone looked inside each of those components and found the nutritional elements, the vitamins, et cetera, the amount of fiber. Well, once you understand that across those ingredients, and you start to realize you could create food based on nutritional level outcomes, instead of based on, well, how many ounces of meat, how many ounces of grain, how many ounces of bone, whatever. And then you have an entirely different way, an entirely more effective way of understanding what you're creating and the value you're creating in the pet food. So the fundamental thing, Cole and Scott, I guess, in the deconstruction of work is this idea that, again, it goes to mental models. If we allowed leaders, employees, and others to think about work in a way that what I like to think of is, if the job description is an ice cube, we allow it to melt, and we allow those drops of water to refreeze in different ways. And even if you did the hypothetical idea of snipping up those job descriptions, there's often situations where that's going to offer leaders and employees freedom to talk about and to consider things that they wouldn't otherwise. Just like you see it in nursing. If you take the job description of nurses, it included looking in on well patients, it including writing schedules for the nursing shifts, that sort of thing. All of those things, automate the schedule writing, give the looking in on well patients to candy stripers or somebody like that. And now what you're left with is a whole bunch of stuff that really needs nurses to do, and that we could emphasize with them. And in fact, once you see what nurses do, if you still have a shortage, you realize that your hospital executives were often physicians before. And so you get them recertified as physicians. And now that work, that not so much the job, there's no job description of a hospital administrator who spends a day on the floor as well, right? That wasn't in the job description. But once they're recertified, if you deconstruct the administrator, you realize that the person inside that job has these capabilities that go with being a physician, even though they're not reflected in the job description. So again, the idea is that if we're looking at the people and the jobs in some more molecular level, I like the concept of capabilities better than skills. I mean, it's pretty simple questions for me. The capabilities side on the part of the person would be, what can you do, or what could we prepare you to do? So very specific. Here are things that you can do. Not so much do you know the Spanish language, but do you know how to simultaneously translate? Do you know how to translate a document, right? And the same thing on the work side is, what do we need done is a fairly straightforward question, and that would get us inside those job descriptions. And then I'll harken back and say, I think a lot of the psychological tools that have been applied to jobs, and I think, frankly, a lot of the confusion is that we weren't working at the molecular level of things that need to get done and things that get done. So if you think about the example Pete and I used of sweepers at Disney, right? The sweeper job description has a lot of stuff in it about cleaning and some stuff in it about entertaining guests. You can't really see the strategic value until you break those apart and draw the payoff curve. So how much better off would Disney be if we made cleaning the park 30% better? Well, not that much, probably. We're already good enough, probably, on keeping the park clean. It's not unimportant, but we're pretty good. How much better would Disney be if we enhanced the ability of sweepers to answer questions, to entertain guests in a surprising way? And you say, oh, yeah, that part of the job. Well, that's really valuable. And so I think that I don't think there's enough to get on a soapbox. I just don't think this discussion is undertaken often enough by leaders and workers about what's really adding value here, and where is what you're doing, where is good enough. You're not going to enhance value by getting better at that. Pete's favorite example is getting tax documents in. It doesn't help to get them in 3 months early. That is not adding value. Even if you could do it, right?
Penalty early there.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing, like how much mileage you can get out of just talking about the mission, vision, and strategy of an organization. Like that will funnel down to everything else that you want to happen, whether it's someone sweeping the park or actually, entertaining the guests. In that case, like probably Disney wants you to provide a great experience for their customers in an entertaining way. Oh, Pete, you faded out there. That's incredible.
Yeah, I had adjusted my camera. Sorry about that.
There's always been a fair amount of like job crafting that goes around that people do on their own, right? But what you're talking about is a much more systematic way to get at what the organization actually needs out of employees and redistribute the actual talent.
Yeah, and I think get a good understanding of it. I think that's the key, Scott, is I'm much more interested in the way people think about this stuff than I am in any particular measurement or outcome of it. And I've always seen measurement as a vehicle to getting people to think better, to make decisions better, to understand things better. That's the ultimate goal. And in my sense, the ultimate evaluation is, are people making better decisions than they would if you hadn't measured this thing? And in this case, I'd say, would people make better decisions if there was kind of an institutionalized capability and requirement that we look at your work and we look at the work and ask these kinds of questions? In addition to whether it could be automated, we actually get a handle on what is the real payoff and what do people think? I think there's probably a lot of equivalent of Disney sweepers running around, maybe not at Disney, but you can imagine the sweepers think that where they add value is sweeping better, right? It's in the job description. It might even be in the title. Well, that to me is the key, is whether we measure stuff or not, would it be helpful to have a process by which the sweepers and their leaders could talk about where they add value at that deconstructed level?
Is that a cultural thing?
I think you have to be careful about mission, vision, and values just a little bit, because what happens is, as companies have gone to scale and with the technology, we're seeing a lot of people try to build enterprise-wide performance management around things at the enterprise scale level. When you think about Disney, they've got cruise lines, they've got movie studios, they've got television studios, they've got theme parks, obviously. They've got and one of the things that John and I are seeing is that we are eliminating the strategic context by aligning it to the very highest level of the enterprise. And it's very, very common. I think about my experience at Toro, where we had at that time 9 significant business units. Some were industry leaders, some were in growing industries, some were, third or fourth place in their industries, some were in margin challenge industries. And it was, the idea of having just one common set of mission, vision, and values, trying to align it. You can't be strategic if you're trying to do a one size fits all when you got 8 different business units in 8 different contexts. And I see a lot of COEs trying to get to scale in effect, robbing the opportunity to be strategic at the level that really matters to line and business unit leaders.
This is also where like Japanese companies will have like a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 500-year plan for how they're going to operate. Like obviously, like trying to project 500 years out isn't probably that accurate, but like it gives you some sort of like time horizons to think about, like what sort of skills you may need in the future, what you want to do in the future, and be able to adjust as different technologies come down the pipeline.
Yeah. What I hear you guys saying is that airline pilots are the most critical role in any company that has airline pilots. That's my takeaway.
I found in working as a CHRO that the concept of pivotal pools is hard to communicate. What works, though, it's the same concept, and it's to find the strategy pivot points and then talk about how close a job is to it. And so the idea, there's such a fairness issue around I'm pivotal and I'm not that gets in the way. But if you can identify the pivot points and then identify job proximity to it, you have a much better chance of being successful. That's the one thing that we've learned in the 20 plus years since we wrote the book is the concepts are right, but there's just some really slight nuances in how it gets implemented to make it effective.
Yeah, Cole, you got served. What's up?
Yeah. Taking my joke and educating me with it. I appreciate it. All right, let's do some confusion matrix.
The confusion matrix.
All right, we got 5 questions for everybody here. And if Cole likes your answer, he will provide you a social media tile that you can share with your friends and family. All right, anyone jump in here. These is kind of wild here. So what's a belief that you held early in your career that you're completely changed your mind about now?
Oh, that's easy. And related to what we did, I think when all of us started doing utility analysis, what we believed was that the only reason executives and others weren't making better decisions is that we had not translated psychology into dollars. That if we just translated this stuff into dollars in a credible way, that would change the way leaders made decisions about people. I think that was, kind of at the heart of all of that. And I think one of the reasons it's fallen out of favor is that in fact, it's much, much more about what Pete is talking about priming leaders on a way to think before we come in with a fully blown analysis. And I think that's still true today. So for me, I think the belief that changed is today what I believe is that the real bottleneck is that leaders come into discussions about people using simplistic, myopic models. It's not so much their fault, but they've never really been held accountable the way they have. And that's what needs to be changed, whether we think about measurement, whether we think about how we define work, et cetera. It isn't just that they're desperately waiting to make better decisions about people, and all they need is the dollar values or a good scorecard or something like that.
I'd say that just that I knew anything. I actually knew stuff, and apparently,
well, sure, yeah. I think the other one is, for me, I had a hypothesis that the HR profession was going to change much faster. If I go back and look at 40 years and look at the research that we did, a lot of the research I did with Ed Lawler, where we did a survey of HR leaders every 3 years or so, really hammered home the point to me that, in fact, the profession is often defined very traditionally. The bulk of HR work in organizations is very, very traditional and very hard to move out of that tradition. And I think of it as an iceberg of HR, right? If you think about all the HR people from the Tobys of the world in the office, or, whatever is your metaphor for that, and then up to the headline leaders that you feature on your program, right? The headline leaders are kind of the iceberg above the water. The futuristic stuff, influence, all that kind of thing. And the iceberg below the water is much, much bigger and tends to be pretty traditional, and it tends to be a difficult thing to move.
That's the way people think about HR. They think about Toby from The Office or someone out to get you, right?
Yeah, and that really affects how people are prepared to hear ideas. I've been shocked. So I'm the same Pete, whether I'm the CFO or I'm the CHRO. And people react to me differently with a different title next to my name. And it isn't because I can't speak. I'm just as financially competent, as a CHRO as I was as a CFO. But the idea, there's some real barriers to that reputation and that history So one of the things John and I've talked about a lot about is just some of the experiences I've had being on both sides, dealing with exactly the same situation, and the halo of the department that I come from, just changing entirely the situation that I find myself in.
Is the guy with the money bags versus the guy that can punish you, right?
It's really interesting.
Okay, let's say you have 1 month, no email, no responsibilities, no professional obligations. What are you doing?
It's easy. I'm going to Lake of Woods, northern Minnesota. I'm going up to Angle Inlet. I'm going up to the Voyageurs National Park. I'm getting as far away from in northern Minnesota and away from everything as I possibly can.
Doing some ice fishing.
Yeah, I'm not a big ice fisher. I mean, there's too many. We lose at least a dozen or two people every year in Minnesota here. Funny thing, I have a friend of mine who lives on a big ice fishing lake, and she's a big extrovert. And she used to cross-country ski and just go talk to the ice fishermen. And I said, Paula, do you realize how much these guys don't want to talk to anybody if they're sitting for 8 hours out on a lake, just in a dark house? But she's saying they weren't very friendly. I go, yeah, so no, that's what I would do.
What are you doing, John?
Yeah, I suppose, I've kind of moved to my lake house in the equivalent of my lake house in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So yeah, I'm probably out on one of the many, many trails out here, trying to get a little closer to nature, and or I may be in a museum somewhere, marveling at the nuances of an indigenous culture, while looking at baskets or pots, etc.
How'd you two ever get together? Both of y'all just seem wanted to self-isolate out in the woods. Or maybe it was a historical trauma or something.
Well, we self-isolated a lot when we were together. I mean, if you tried to look for Pete and me of an evening after we'd been running a workshop, what you would find is the pair of us walking sometimes for hours, just talking together in whatever city it was. We just head off, and before we knew it, a couple of hours would have been passed, and we'd have been self-isolated, in that way together.
I'm gonna guess Cole is gonna go golfing. Is that right, Cole?
I was just thinking, I would get so anxious. I would end the month with like 7 more projects that I was working on.
Yeah.
That sounds right. Honestly, yeah. Okay, well, we'll wrap it up with this one. Like, what is one everyday skill or habit that you rely on that has nothing to do with academia or business, but makes you better at your work?
As silly as it sounds, one of the best things I learned in high school is how to type.
How to type? Oh yeah.
Back in those days, it was taught with manual typewriters, and early on in my career, I was in software development, and so that ability to touch type and move and be comfortable around it. Silly as it sounds, it's probably one of the most important things I learned early in my career, and it's served me well ever since.
Were those QWERTY typewriters like the same format that you have on a laptop now?
I love that, Pete. Yeah, I love the generational difference that Cole is asking that actual question, right? Like for you and me, it's like, well, of course, QWERTY typewriters, that was the 1960s, 1970s. We were using those to do punch cards to feed into massive mainframe computers and get a little COBOL computer program to run. So it's been QWERTY. What was amazing to me is that QWERTY did hold up, that that weird keyboard design that was
QWERTY does
in the 20s
hold up.
Or whatever.
You can modify it to like the Dvorak system as well. I got a friend that uses that, and boy, you talk about trying to do things left-handed. I mean, oh my God.
Right. I've always been grateful for my math background. You know what I mean? So I was a math major undergrad, and it gave me comfort. Was just everything else I did built on that afterwards. So that's what made the economics accessible. That's what made IO psychology accessible. Was my math, was my foundation in math.
Yeah.
So one of the things that as this podcast has gotten more popular, when it first started, it was basically just our friend group who we had on as guests, and is we have people from different generations coming on the podcast, and so I have to explain it to people. It's like it has a very millennial feel to it. Because like people aren't expecting this type of podcast relationship when doing this. So I appreciate the call out, John.
It was all meant positively, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You said punch cards. Like I'd be remiss if I didn't like relay this one sweet story about my grandparents and how they met. My grandparents, my grandfather worked for IBM. This is like in the 1920s or something like that in Beaumont, Texas. And my grandmother would come and purposely mess up the punch cards on the IBM machine just so he would have to come around the office and she could talk to him.
That's cute.
And they wound up getting married. And like the rest is history.
So
That's a
I
good one.
learned a new phrase from Cole. I would call that a meet cute.
Oh gosh.
Whoa. Wait, what?
You didn't learn it from me. He's clearly been listening to the podcast. That was Holly Lamb's episode. She explained what a meet cute was. I did not know what it was. I know what it is now.
Yeah, so I think Scott had just described a meet cute, if I understand it correctly.
Oh man. I gotta listen to this Holly Lamb episode.
Let's do some nerdery.
The nerdery.
I will tee us up with the
Where you want to
first
start?
one. Yeah, I think I'm gonna start us with the how many people does your company have, or how many people does it need? I think the reason why I chose this one is sort of because the conversation we were having around work without jobs and what's going on here. And so a lot of these AI companies are making commitments to say how few people they actually need per the revenue per employee that they're going to dictate. And there's this company called Agency AI that has made a formal commitment to cap their full-time headcount at 100 people. And it's the company's guiding principles, basically saying no matter how much the company grows, they're never going to have more than 100 people. And so there's a lot of different things going on here. They give a few examples: Midjourney, Cursor, Cal AI, 11 Labs, of how much revenue that they have and how few employees the organization actually has. But I think about this in terms of what we show here isn't really about HR per se, but with AI coming and potentially deconstructing a lot of the work that's done, is there a potential in the future that the whole concept of people analytics or of even like human variability that we've talked about in this podcast isn't really necessary because the sample sizes are too small, because organizations themselves are at such small organizations that the traditional analyses that we've done that required large sample sizes aren't really relevant anymore. And so I thought the two of you are some of the most brilliant people in talking about these things. What do you see that's happening? What do you see that's coming? And how does this overlay with some of the work that you've done in the past?
Well, I think it is. I mean, my first reaction to that is it's certainly attention getting, and that may be the point. Again, I think I always find it illuminating to take the analogy to something that isn't people, and ask if the executive would feel the same way about being public about that, right? So, what if we, pick anything, right? We're gonna never use more than 100 suppliers, no matter how big we get. Right. Because, we feel that efficiency in supplier management is very, very important to strategic success. And so that, and I think if you said that, you would be presented with a requirement that you walk that through a rigorous model. What is it? What is our relationship with suppliers? How do they create value? What is the cost of having more than 100 suppliers? What point does it tip over to be inefficient to have 3,000 different suppliers? And of course, there's a bureaucratic point at which the value of having more of those suppliers just doesn't justify the cost. But is it 100? Would you come out with that number in particular and say we'll never be bigger than that? So my reaction is kind of, it's attention getting. But I think I would wish for a much more rigorous approach to that, and it may be less, it might be more, but that we step back and we really ask, what is the framework we use to decide when adding people actually creates greater value, particularly if you're a growing organization. I also think what it really begins to tee up is executives are trying to get their head around having AI or automation be a part of the strategic planning process for let's call it talent or capacity. And so what happens when you have AI as a part of your human capital portfolio? or automation or something like that. You see it in the Shopify example, saying you don't get to hire until you prove to me that AI couldn't do the thing you're hiring for, sort of turning that completely on its head. I was just on an investor call with a company that that has an AI agent, basically, right, that they built. And it's an agent that can do the kinds of things that first-year law students can do, first-year market researchers can do, that kind of thing, right? Pretty defined kind of work that you can tell an agent, go do this, right? Like go look up all the cases that are relevant to this particular court case, or go do a market analysis of our competitors, both of which are really well developed. Now, how do they go to a company, right? They've chosen to go to companies by having the AI apply for the job. So if you're a hiring manager, you get an applicant from this organization and you ask it questions, and the AI responds to your questions, and you decide if you want to proceed with that person or that entity into the next stage of interviews or whatever. And at the end of the day, the organization recognizes this is an automated agent that answered the questions perfectly, and that seems pretty well suited to doing that kind of first year work. So I think part of what's going on here is, how are we going to think about AI, just to take an example of automation? And what if we thought about it as actually a part of what we might call the labor pool or the work pool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How much of your planning is, go ahead, Scott.
It's like just another node in the network, right? At that point.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder how much of it is like signaling as well. Like, we are a forward-thinking company, and the people that we do have here, you're highly valued because you're one of the 100.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm not going to trust the AI agent has passed the Turing test until it starts complaining about applicant tracking systems and how hard it is to apply and how they have to update their resume every time. That's when we'll really know that they're good.
Oy vey.
Yeah.
Yep. Lobbying for return to punch cards.
I would love it if we found out this company only has like 10 employees. They're just like out here like shooting off the cuff here.
Yeah.
Well, my first reaction to that, there's really good economic theory about why certain industries have companies of certain size and other industries have companies that don't have different size. And it has to do, just a simple example. Why do we only have 5 or 6 mega CPA firms and we have dozens and dozens of large law firms? And it has to do with the structure of the industry and things like that. And I think AI will change the structure of the industries without any doubt. But it's pretty not easy, but it's pretty straightforward to apply that knowledge that we already have and say, how will AI change the structure of companies within an industry on a number of factors? And there's some really good theory around that can be applied to what's the change now that we have AI.
Yeah. Well, Scott, what do you want to hit us with next?
Let's go to surprising combinations of research. Contents and contacts are related to impact. Like, I have very few articles these days that really get me going, but I read this and I thought it was absolutely amazing. So, like, think about those like really big ideas in science and technology. They really come to life when you have different worlds colliding. So this paper looks at essentially tens of millions of citations and patent data, and they use this hypergraph model. Scroll down a little bit, Cole. Like, there's a really cool visual down here. Yeah. So this hypergraph model essentially takes the content, so like the keywords of different citations and patents, it matches it up to the context. So it's like where it was actually published. And they were able to predict with 95% accuracy, like if something was going to be like a hit or not. So the research with the most outsized impact, so the most citations or, the highest cited patents, was strongly linked to unexpected combinations. It's most often when researchers published in one field about problems in another field. So I think about Pete here, like he's a finance guy applying it to the world of IO. Novelty is a strong indicator of future influence, but you can make an impact on either these areas, both in the like contents that you provide, like novel contents, or novel context separately. So it feels like it's hitting on 2 different areas. Let's see. Scientists tend to be 5 times more likely to cite from their home journals, so they kind of signal that they like IOP or whatever sort of journal you have here, and surprising teams with diverse backgrounds. These like expeditions is what they call them, published work for another field, tend to make the biggest waves as possible. But like really, really cool sort of study going on here about how we can actually improve other fields and like kind of mix things up.
Yeah. I remember this made me think about, this was a little while ago. We had Ryan Hammond on as a guest, and he had a background in org theory. And one of the things that he mentioned is he had a colleague of his, I believe, was getting a PhD in economics, and their professor threw down on their desk a book from org theory and said, read through this. Somewhere in here is your dissertation. And basically like saying, if you were able to cut across disciplines, you're going to be able to find a really cool and unique dissertation. And so I thought that this is a fascinating line of research, and you guys, again, like what Scott said, really emulate this effectively. But I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
Well, I think I would say that's been my experience. That for me, I mean, it's not that there haven't been enormous insights that have come to me through what we might call the traditional HR area, and I've been very fortunate to have worked in great institutions and with great mentors and others in that particular field. But I would agree that it's the cross-disciplinary stuff where I have found my eyes being opened. It was, I had a period where I was walking across the street to the business school at Cornell, working with a bunch of engineers and others who were operations research engineers. And you'd go in and you'd say, well, have we thought about the reactions people have? I had one really talented PhD student, and he said, I don't think we've looked enough at how people react to what they see going on around them, like on an assembly line. And what he found was that the mathematics of the assembly line didn't really reflect that the person doing the work would be able to see stuff piling up to their left or to their right and slow down or speed up their work, which is a perfectly natural thing. Like, right, if you see the supply next to you that you have to work on going up, you're going to work faster. If you see that your work is piling up after you and the person next after you isn't getting through the pile, you're going to slow up a little bit, right? And it turned out that when you put those things in, you had a much better predictor of how the supply chain worked and why it worked, even when the math might say, no, you're going to have big pileups here. And you'd say, well, no, we're not getting those. And well, what could possibly explain that, right? And it was the psychology of the person doing that work, and I think a lot of the metaphors we're seeing today have to do with that crossover, whether it's to math or economics or accounting. Again, for me, I talk about leaders' smart brains and how they come at disciplines like production or engineering or finance or accounting even with mental models that are far more sophisticated than they are when they think about people.
And the other power of looking across disciplines, and this has really been really impactful for me over the years, is you can look at different kinds of evolutions. So the evolution measurement system, I've talked a lot, and we've written about how finance systems evolve. You can learn a lot about how time zones evolve. Okay, and there's a lot of facts around how time zones evolved. Okay, to what's going on in people analytics now, 100 years from now. A lot of information that came through what the land grant universities and how we manage crops. To what it doesn't have just be finance, but the whole idea of Nielsen ratings, and things like that, there's just a lot of, so not only can you cross disciplines, but you can cross decades or centuries.
Oh, absolutely.
And then learn from how those things evolved and make some pretty good predictions about what are some of the things that should or should not work and how people analytics should evolve and could evolve along the way.
I love Douglas Hubbard's book, How to Measure Anything. And like one of his tenets is, if you have a problem, like go look at another field. They've probably already dealt with it, and they probably dealt with it better than you could. So like it's probably problems already been solved.
I'm going to call this episode "Why Time Zones Evolved."
Well, when it took you 5 months to get from New York to California, it didn't matter what time it was when you got there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the railroads were the big drivers.
Well, it sounds like that's a very directionally correct response. Scott, do you want to hit us with our last article today?
5 reasons why leaders never say directionally correct. So this guy essentially argues that saying directionally correct is just kind of a reckless term. I'll quickly run through his rationale. 5 different reasons. Directionally correct has no agreed upon definition. Doesn't even mean what people think it means. Directionally correct decisions may or may not lead to good business outcomes. Using the phrase directionally correct degrades data culture by promoting incomplete data analysis. And directionally correct analysis never provides sufficient explanatory power that hold anyone accountable. Sorry, something just fell in the room here.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you guys. I
Right
see
off the
you
wall.
both. I see
Scott,
you both
did someone
leaders.
throw a rock through the window or something? Or
Yeah, that's right. Like we're right at time. Like someone's like
with
beating
that
on the window
article
to get
wrapped
in this
around
room.
it, right? Yeah.
Well, I see you guys both as leaders. Do you ever say the words directionally correct?
My former boss, CEO, his favorite quote, he said it once a week, if not more often. Change is good as long as it's in the right direction. I think he attributed it to Churchill.
Mm.
You know what I mean? But when someone had a proposal, it was usually a way to be skeptical about the proposal. You know what I mean? Well, change is good, but is it in the right direction? So I lived with that for a number of years as the CEO's decision maker's go-to framework is as a way to think about change for itself is not good. But anyway, that's my initial reaction when I see that.
It's a spectrum, right? Like you can do the most deep analysis in the world, right, and come up with a perfect answer, but it'll be 6 months down the line. And if you need an answer today, like, what are you gonna do with that?
Yeah. The same CEO was very good about saying, "I don't want any uncertainty that's coming from lack of deep thinking." Yeah, we're gonna have uncertainty.
Yeah.
But I do not want to accept uncertainty that results from his team not doing their homework. And I thought that was really insightful.
That's a good phrase. I like that.
You know, so it's a corollary of direct. But that was his counterpoint. Yeah, we're always going to have risk, but I don't want risks that absolutely are manageable with good thinking and good analysis in advance.
Well, that's the whole point of analysis, right? Like, is uncertainty reduction, right? It's not uncertainty elimination.
Right.
Like we'd all be millionaires and billionaires if we could.
Well, I'll probably regret saying this, but Carlos Kimini, the guy who wrote the article in 2020 about Directionally Correct, you have an open invite to come on the podcast, and we'll debate you that Directionally Correct is actually a great term. So well done. But well, John and Pete, you guys are fantastic guests today. Thank you so much for joining us. Scott, any final words before I give John and Pete the final words?
Pete, John, man, hang in there. Things will work out eventually. I believe in you guys, so just hang in there. That's all I want y'all to do.
I feel better already. Thank you, Scott.
I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate what you guys are doing with these podcasts and the kind of guests you have and the kind of questions you ask and stuff. And I think it's really, really interesting stuff.
A lot of fun today. A lot of fun.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Coming from you, that's high praise. That's directionally correct praise right there for you. So, well, you've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott, and today's guests, Dr. John Boudreau and Pete Ramstad. Thanks for joining us today, guys.